Cambridge, England. The protagonist of the story is Stephen Hawking, a student of cosmology. He is racing on his bicycle against his roommate Brian. They enter a student club to grab a beer, where Stephen becomes attracted to a student named Jane Wilde. Nervously, he approaches her to introduce himself. Jane is his complete opposite, studying art. They talked until late into the night, and as they parted ways, Jane wrote down her phone number for him. Professor Siam handed out a sheet of 10 complex problems to the students, which they had to solve within a few days. At the pub, Stephen sees Jane again, but she is already with another guy and shows no interest in spending time with him. Brian fusses over the problems and asks Stephen how many of them he has solved, but Stephen hasn't even looked at the sheet yet and puts them aside for later. With music playing and spilling his coffee, Hawking finally starts working on the assignment, scribbling solutions on top of a trained schedule. He manages to solve 9 out of the 10 problems. The impressed professor invites the brilliant student to discuss the topic of his undecided dissertation. However, our hero is more concerned about his new acquaintance. He waits for Jane by the church and immediately invites her to a family dinner. Jane is deeply religious, which cannot be said about Stephen, as he cannot allow the divine creator to interfere with his precise calculations. Right away, Stephen invites Jane to a ball, and she agrees without hesitation. However, she doesn't have much fun with him. Nevertheless, he knows a lot of interesting facts about stars, ultraviolet light, and men's suspenders. It seems that completely different people can have an interesting and enjoyable time together. Left alone, the young man takes Jane's hand, kisses her, and finally asks her to dance. Stephen rushes to catch a departing train, but struggles with walking for some reason. The best students are brought to meet the renowned mathematician Ben Rose, who gives a lecture on black holes. On the way back, Stephen is lost in thought. He wants to apply Ben Rose's theory to the entire universe, rewind time, and understand how this universe came into existence. Siam suggests that Stephen mathematically substantiates how black holes could have played a role in the creation of the universe. Stephen stands at the board for hours, but the chalk keeps slipping from his hand. The young man's gait becomes unsteady, his legs weaken, and he falls, hitting his head hard. Stephen lies motionless on the hospital table. As the doctor extracts his spinal fluid, Stephen can hardly move his right arm and leg. The doctor diagnoses him with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, a progressive disease that affects the brain cells responsible for muscle activity, such as swallowing, walking, breathing, and speaking. Stephen faces the gradual deterioration of his muscles paralysis. He has a maximum of 2 years left, but his mind will remain intact, even though no one will know what he's thinking. The doomed student now sits on a mattress in the corner of the room. Brian wanted to cheer him up, but upon learning that his friend has only 2 years to live, he became flustered and simply left the room. Then Jane called, but Stephen didn't answer the phone, so she decided to visit him personally. Stephen hid and didn't open the door. Brian told her about the tragedy that had befallen his friend. However, Jane managed to meet her boyfriend while he was watching TV in the dormitory lounge. Stephen asks her to leave, but she threatens that if he doesn't come with her to play croquet right away, she'll never see him again. Stephen immediately gets up and limps towards the field. Jane trembles, tears welling up in her eyes at the sight of Stephen, who struggles to control his body. She never realized it was so bad. He flees back into the room and once again asks Jane to leave him alone. He only has 2 years left and needs to work. But Jane confesses her love for Stephen and promises to be with him until the end. The student informs the professor that the topic of his dissertation will be time. Stephen's father, Frank, invites Jane to talk. Frank says there will be no duel, just a very difficult defeat. Jane responds that she is a strong person and loves his son, so she will fight the illness together with Stephen. Soon, the couple gets married, and they have a son. The disease progresses, and Hawking crawls down the stairs and moves with the help of 2 crutches, barely dragging his legs on the ground. His speech has also deteriorated. The professors criticize Stephen's dissertation, at least the first 3 chapters, but the 4th one on black holes at the beginning of time is brilliant. Hawking earns his doctorate, but he doesn't stop there. He wants to prove his theory and derive one simple equation that explains everything. Friends throw a celebration for Stephen, but while the students socialize and joke, Stephen struggles with a pea on his plate. It's not so easy for everyone to control their hands and instruments. Upstairs, his son Robert watches him. One day, Jane silently rolls a wheelchair into the kitchen, and Stephen silently collapses into it. Despite his condition, the scientist tries not to despair. Soon, the couple has a second child, a daughter named Lucy. Jane finds herself torn between caring for her husband and their children. Trapped in a sweater, an idea is born in his mind. Jane brings her husband to the university. It's difficult to understand what Stephen is saying, but the professors catch every word of the young genius. According to his theory, particles gradually escape from a black hole, and eventually, it compresses and turns into nothingness. This helps prove that time and the universe had a beginning. Several scientific husbands are outraged and call his words nonsense, but others recognize the genius of his theory. Hawking's works start getting published in top scientific journals. Jane and the children prepare a gift for Stephen, an electric wheelchair that he can now control himself. Unfortunately, Jane has absolutely no time or energy for her own dissertation. The Hawking family arrived at their country house, bringing along the challenge of getting Stephen and his wheelchair into the house. During lunch, Stephen choked, which has been happening frequently lately. Jane is exhausted, struggling to handle the children and her seriously ill husband. Her mother suggests she find some distraction by joining the church choir since Jane sings beautifully. At the church, she meets a young widower named Jonathan. He offers to teach Robert how to play the piano. Jonathan stays for dinner and tries to feed Stephen peas. He attempts to engage in conversation and asks the host about his project. Stephen's speech has deteriorated to the point where Jane has to act as his translator. The scientist has a new idea that contradicts the old one, suggesting that the universe has no boundaries or beginnings. He plans to develop a theory that explains the interaction of everything in the world. Jane has also become knowledgeable in physics and uses potatoes and peas to explain to the guest the pillars on which physics stands. Jonathan has no children or commitments, so he offers his help to the Hawkings. Stephen doesn't say anything to his wife about it and simply retreats to his room, but later, in bed, he expresses that he won't object if she seeks assistance from Jonathan. Jonathan starts spending a lot of time with the family, taking on the responsibility of pushing Stephen's wheelchair and becoming an integral part of the family. This significantly eases Jane's life, although the nature of her relationship with the new friend is not entirely clear. One day, she informs Jonathan that she is pregnant, as many others mistakenly believe that Stephen was no longer capable of conceiving. After the birth of their third child, Timmy, during a family celebration, Stephen's father advises hiring a caregiver. However, they cannot afford one, and they already have a helper. Frank hints that their son is a world-renowned celebrity, and such relationships are not suitable for their family. Stephen's angry mother bluntly asks Jane who Timmy's father is. Jonathan overhears this and immediately decides to leave the house, tired of all the gossip since he's only been helping. But the problem is that he genuinely loves Jane, and she also has feelings for him, which further convinces Jonathan to leave the family. Now Jane has to handle everything on her own again. Hawking goes to the church to see Jonathan, bringing 2 bottles of beer. He doesn't know what's going on between Jonathan and his wife, but asks his friend to help once more. He is flying to France, where he has been invited to an opera. Jane will take a break with the children in the countryside, and Jonathan agrees to accompany them. Perhaps this is what Jane's family could have been like if her husband had been her support and helper, but she made her choice. The family's friend ends up sleeping in a small tent. During the performance, Stephen's condition worsens. He starts coughing up blood and is taken away on a stretcher. Stephen has pneumonia, and now he lies connected to a ventilator. The doctor suggests to Jane that she can disconnect the machine at any time if she wishes, but she is angered by this suggestion. The second option is to perform a tracheotomy, which means making an incision in the trachea, but in that case, Stephen will never be able to speak again. Hawking has to return to Cambridge, and Jane says goodbye to Jonathan. The operation begins, which will permanently rob the scientist of his speech. Jane visits Stephen in the hospital and brings a board with letters. They are divided into 6 color-coded groups, and Stephen is supposed to blink when he hears the correct color, and then blink again when Jane mentions a specific letter. The spouses are desperate. Stephen isn't blinking, but he continues to move his lips, trying to say something, while Jane repeatedly lists the colors. To take care of her husband, Jane hires Elaine, a nurse with excellent recommendations. The first thing Stephen requests through the board is a cup of tea. The moderately strict nurse quickly finds a connection with him. In the evening, Elaine praises Stephen. He is a wonderful patient, a genius, and also cheerful. After some time, Hawking was presented with a computer with a speech synthesizer. With its help, Stephen would be able to communicate and write using a switch in his working finger, at a rate of about 4 words per minute. Once he got the hang of it, Stephen decided to write a book about time using this method. He won a bet against Professor Thorne for publication in the adult magazine Penthouse. Elaine took the new literature seriously, and gladly allowed the professor to examine the pages with nude women. Hawking came up with a title for his book, A Brief History of Time. He barely communicated with his wife, but shone brightly in Elaine's presence. One day, Stephen deeply hurt his loyal Jane when he typed out a message that the machine reproduced. I asked Elaine to accompany me to America. Stephen wanted the nurse to accompany him on the trip for an award, not his wife. They were only giving him 2 years to live, the spouses reminisced, but he was still alive, and that was a very long time. I loved you so much, I did everything I could, Jane said. Stephen's face contorted even more with a grimace of crying, tears streaming down his face. And that's how the Hawking family life ended. Jane went to the church to meet Jonathan, and they were finally able to be together. A Brief History of Time was published in 1988 and became a bestseller. On stage, Stephen Hawking is introduced by his longtime colleague, Professor Thorne, with Brian also in the audience. Stephen himself enters the stage and playfully answers students' questions. Suddenly, a pen falls on the floor. Stephen ponders, raises his head, stands up, straightens his posture, confidently walks over to the pen, picks it up, and hands it to a student. But this beautiful fantasy quickly comes to an end. Stephen concludes his speech with the words, There's always a possibility to succeed in something as long as there is life, there is hope. A year later, Stephen sends a letter to Julie. The Queen of England, Elizabeth II, invites the couple to honor Stephen with the Order of the Companions of Honor.
It's all been rather extraordinary, though, hasn't it?
Says Julie. Stephen looks at their 3 children and writes to his wife.
Look what we made.